Our story kicks off with a chubby guy getting beat up. Yep, that's our protagonist, Wu Lingzhen, a nerd with a serious problem saying no. Because of his looks, he's been bullied by his stronger classmates ever since he was a kid. To cope, he buried himself in his studies, convinced that once he joined the workforce, skills would matter more than looks, and people would stop calling him a disgusting fat otaku. Unfortunately, reality hit hard. Despite all his studying, he realized he was just a chubby otaku who didn't know much. To make matters worse, he wasn't a great student either. Post-graduation, he could only get a job using his size as a sparring partner. Our guy had no choice but to accept, because, as they say, when you're lost, any road will do, but it was more of the same. Now, instead of school, he was just getting pushed around at the gym. At one point, he wondered why he kept getting roped into all this. Just then, Supervisor Mei Renqing called him over to help with a monthly report. Our guy was puzzled. He was just a sparring partner. But Mei wasn't really looking for an answer, so Wu agreed to do it. And that was just the beginning of a snowball effect. People started tossing their work his way, and like I said, our guy can't say no. He was swamped with tasks, working into the next night without even a break, wondering why he didn't just turn everyone down in the first place. He wasn't getting any extra pay or recognition, and with all the work piling up, his health was starting to take a hit, not to mention the constant beatings his body was enduring. At this low point, he remembered the doctor's words warning him to lose weight or else. He began wondering if he was about to die and figured he should at least call an ambulance. But as luck would have it, his phone notified him that his balance had run out. Accepting his fate, he decided he'd just let go. But before dying, he had one last mission. He wouldn't go down as the disgusting fat otaku. He'd pay his debts and, with that, die in peace. If there were another life, he vowed not to repeat the same mistakes. In a final twist of fate, he accidentally sent his report folder to his supervisor during a meeting, who opened it, impressed at Wu's efficiency, only to find study materials. Meanwhile, Wu was actually reincarnated, but this time wasn't exactly what you'd expect. Instead of the usual skip of a few years, it had been 20,000 years. Our guy, now called Wu Lingzhen, was approached by a girl from the Demon Fox clan, Tu Shan Xiaoyu, let's just call her Xiaoyu, who reminded him of their plan to explore the outside world together. But Wu had been so focused on training that he spent 20,000 years in seclusion and was still just a regular guy with slightly better strength. To top it off, he wasn't even human anymore but a demonic being and the young master of his clan. His lack of special abilities frustrated him, especially in a world of martial arts where everyone seemed to have powers except him. But hey, he wasn't entirely helpless. That snake he just killed? He figured he'd eat it, unaware it was a golden core dragon in disguise. Xiaoyu, who knew more about the world, just watched on, not bothering to fill him in. Soon after, a stranger showed up accusing him of stealing his dragon. Turns out this guy, Xiao Xuanhua, was an instructor at Shentian Academy, and he wasn't happy. He accused Wu of shamelessness, assuming only someone from the demon sect would pull a stunt like this. At first, Wu was speechless but quickly apologized, saying he hadn't meant to offend. But Xuanhua was having none of it. He declared Wu should die for his disrespect and threw his sword. Wu, surprisingly, blocked it with one hand, which left the instructor dumbfounded. Wu, however, was still scared stiff, declaring that even though Xuanhua had tried to kill him, he managed to stop the sword. That's why he apologized. But seriously, it's hard to believe. The guy's so strong, yet he just stands there doing nothing. And at this point, the instructor declared it was impossible. After all, an ordinary guy with no spiritual roots shouldn't be able to catch his flying sword. He was sure Xiaoyu was secretly helping our protagonist. Xiaoyu then warned that if she attacked the old man, he'd be a goner. For a moment, he was lost for words, then called her arrogant and declared they could both go to hell together. With that, he threw 3 more swords. But protagonist blocked the attack again, leaving the instructor in disbelief. And again, protagonist apologized, though this time for not being able to kill Xiaoyu but definitely being able to kill the instructor. Seeing this, Xiaoyu was touched. Protagonist was actually protecting her. While lying on the ground, the instructor declared that protagonist would surely die since he couldn't fend off so many flying swords. But of course, protagonist took them all, right? And for the 3rd time, he apologized for taking the swords. I don't get this guy anymore. Judging by the instructor's face, he must have been ready to call it quits, and that's exactly what he did. His expression changed from war to peace. Claiming it had all been a misunderstanding, he asked for his swords back, saying he'd be on his way. So protagonist handed them over, but maybe he forgot his own strength because he threw them so fast they caught fire, causing an explosion. He didn't return them to be kind, though he just couldn't refuse a request. The instructor looked absolutely soul-crushed. At that point, protagonist told Xiaoyu they should head back to cook the snake for his parents. As they left, Xiaoyu warned the instructor to stay quiet about what happened that day. It seems the tables turned, right? Now it's the instructor who can't talk. Xiaoyu rejoined protagonist while the instructor, left in shock, wondered what on earth had just happened and who these people were. But he wasn't about to let it go. He decided he'd tell the Xuanzhong Academy elder about this encounter to make sure all those demonic cultivators paid the price. Meanwhile, Xiaoyu was telling protagonist that even cultivators at the Starfall Alpha Soul stage could be defeated by him, though protagonist still insisted he was just an average person. Xiaoyu probably began to wonder if her brother was a bit of an idiot, but protagonist was convinced he was just a regular person with no spiritual roots, which is why he trained his body so hard. To make it funnier, he was training the entire time they talked. Xiaoyu, who clearly had a thing for protagonist, seemed to enjoy his cluelessness, even finding it cute. Eventually, they arrived at what seemed to be protagonist's home, a cave complete with a sign warning of a demonic presence. Inside, protagonist came across several people who were furious, asking who dared enter their territory, as it belonged to the demonic sect. Protagonist then announced he'd brought snake meat for everyone. Instantly, their expressions shifted from hostility to joy, and they welcomed him with open arms. While they ate, protagonist reflected that they might not seem like the nicest folks. Just then, his father appeared, saying it had been 3 whole hours since they'd last seen each other, wondering if protagonist had given up on being his son. 3 hours. What a reunion. And protagonist's father, Woody, was the leader of the demonic sect, which made protagonist the young master. But when protagonist tried to explain the delay, Woody cut him off, saying he knew very well what had happened and wasn't buying the cooking the snake excuse. He accused Xiaoyu of persuading protagonist to go down the mountain again. Protagonist tried to explain, even admitting he wanted to go down the mountain, but Woody wasn't having it, shouting louder than he ever had. He warned protagonist that although he had been sealed there for 20,000 years, he still remembered the tricks of the so-called righteous cultivators. If protagonist ventured down the mountain without experience, he'd end up dead, leaving Woody to bury his own son. Once again, protagonist apologized, though he'd heard this lecture countless times over the past 20,000 years. Even if it meant facing danger, he didn't want to stay stuck in that secluded mountain anymore. The other demons were panicking because leaving would be suicide. If he faced a righteous cultivator, they knew he'd be outmatched. At that moment, Xiaoyu chimed in, saying they'd already encountered a righteous cultivator at the Rising Soul stage, and protagonist defeated him with a single punch. Woody was stunned, still grappling with the fact that protagonist was so strong despite lacking spiritual roots. Even with the strength of a rising soul, Woody warned him not to think himself invincible just because he'd beaten 1 or 2 cultivators at the Almanac End stage. However, Prota stated he was not so interested in becoming invincible. He knew that only by reaching the tribulation stage could he break the seal and free everyone from that cursed deep forest on the mountain. Yet, being stuck in such isolation, he couldn't even move past the body refinement phase. Hearing this, protagonist's father asked everyone if they told him that story. Protagonist continued, saying that over these 20,000 years, even while sealed, his father had protected him. Now it was his turn to return the favor. At that moment, Xiaoyu chimed in, reminding everyone that since protagonist was stuck in the body refinement stage, he had no demonic aura. As long as he didn't acknowledge himself as a demon, no one would realize he was a demon descendant. But protagonist's father was still uneasy. If protagonist even released a hint of demonic energy, the righteous sect members would undoubtedly try to kill him. Protagonist had already made up his mind, though. As he was leaving, his father threw something to him, a small object, maybe a key. It turned out to be the entrance exam token for Shen Tian Academy. Since protagonist was so eager to leave, his father thought this might be a good first stop. Protagonist recalled that Shen Tian Academy was indeed the same academy where that instructor taught. It was also known as the best academy for righteous cultivators. The academy boasted that anyone who joined could eventually reach the golden core stage, so expectations were high. Naturally, Xiaoyu raised a valid question. Why go straight to the righteous faction's stronghold? Wouldn't that be incredibly dangerous? Protagonist's father replied that sometimes the most dangerous place is the safest, as they'd never expect a demonic cultivator to hide in plain sight. Besides, the academy offered numerous cultivation paths, making it the best place for protagonist to find a suitable method. 2 birds with 1 stone. So, protagonist began packing mostly training supplies, but let's skip that. Xiaoyu questioned how protagonist's father even obtained the exam token while being sealed there, but he brushed her off, saying it wasn't her concern. Since he couldn't protect protagonist any longer, sending him to Shen Tian Academy was the best way to keep him safe. He also also entrusted Xiaoyu, the nearly emperor-level nine-tailed fox, to safeguard protagonist's demonic secret. Xiaoyu accepted, but then a practical question arose. Who would bring them food once they left? Realizing this, everyone scrambled to eat quickly, knowing it might be their last meal together. And if protagonist's father kept talking, he might not get a piece himself. Just as Xiaoyu started to leave, protagonist's father called her back. She assumed he wanted food again, but he declared that the world was nearing collapse and that protagonist's hidden powers would awaken soon, so she was on borrowed time. Switching scenes to Xian Tian Academy, a large crowd was lined up to take the entrance exam, each needing a token, but most people were fixated on one figure, our protagonist, who looked genuinely scared, having rarely encountered righteous cultivators before, aside from that instructor. Protagonist couldn't help but feel he'd attracted attention somehow, maybe because he was practically carrying a mountain of gear on his back. At that moment, one of the instructors instructed everyone to place their exam tokens into a stone lion's mouth, which would detect authenticity and expose any spies. To demonstrate, the first person in line inserted his token, and the lion's collar glowed, signaling he was clear to enter. Watching this, protagonist, already terrified, practically panicked, thinking his father might have given him a fake token. Just then, someone yelled as the stone lion's mouth clamped down on an examinee's hand, revealing him as a demon by the flashing red light. A random bystander explained that the lion was made of special material, and if it detected anything amiss, it would bite and never release. Naturally, the demon was immediately apprehended. Now it was protagonist's turn, and people were already eyeing him suspiciously due to his bulky bag. Shaking with nerves, he put his token in, hoping not to mess up. The token seemed fine at first, but then the lion's mouth began glowing red, grabbing protagonist's hand. Reacting instinctively, protagonist swung his hand, accidentally shattering the stone lion in the process. The instructor, completely baffled, asked what happened. As usual, protagonist apologized, offering to glue the lion back together. Trying to maintain his cover, protagonist argued that the lion glowed blue initially, which didn't make sense if it detected a demon. The instructor corrected him, saying the lion only attacked when it sensed demonic energy. So why did the lion attack protagonist? At that moment, protagonist began to wonder if he did have demonic energy lingering in his body. After all, he'd spent 20 years close to his parents, who were full of demonic energy. It's kind of like standing near someone who smokes, you end up inhaling a bit of that smoke yourself. Just then, Xiaoyu stepped in, telling everyone to hold off since things hadn't been clarified yet. Besides, righteous cultivators were notoriously careless with their prisoners. The instructor then questioned why Xiaoyu, a member of the monster clan, was meddling in Xian Tian Academy's affairs. Xiaoyu replied that it was simple. She was protagonist's guardian, so naturally, she'd get involved. According to the murmuring crowd, guardians were special figures sent by powerful sects to protect important disciples. The instructor decided that, since protagonist's admission was already confirmed, they'd just have to keep a closer eye on his background. He looked at protagonist's token and noticed it bore the name of the number 1 sect in the world. Xiaoyu confirmed that this was indeed the sect protagonist was heir to, a sect destroyed by demonic cultivators 20,000 years ago. People began to question how the number 1 sect could have fallen to demonic cultivators, until someone pointed out that the name was purely symbolic. It didn't mean it was actually powerful. Returning to the matter of the token, Xiaoyu pointed out that it made sense for it to contain traces of demonic energy. One of the instructor's assistants then suggested that protagonist might have unknowingly inherited the legacy of the number 1 sect in the world. Due to the delicate balance between righteous cultivators and the demon clan, the instructor grudgingly let protagonist in, but warned him to stay on his best behavior. Once inside, Xiaoyu reassured protagonist to stay calm. As long as he acted naturally, no one would suspect him. Meanwhile, another instructor, Mei Yanli, was observing the new disciples. Suddenly, a flamboyant instructor with a brightly colored beard, resembling a clown, asked how the new recruits were doing. This instructor, Huang Luhong, who we'll just keep calling the clown, had a beard so colorful that it was hard to take him seriously. Instructor Mei reported that there were some promising students in this batch, including recruits from both the Yujian and Hahuan sections. Among them was a girl from the Yujian sect named Bai Di, and from the Hahuan sect, a guy named Tai Xiankao. Immediately, Tai Xiankao tried to get close to Bai Di, claiming he wanted to practice dual cultivation with her, to which she flatly refused. As Bai Di looked around, unimpressed by the recruits, instructor Mei pointed out that there was one student who stood out, though not in a good way. Protagonist, unaware of the attention, was just acting as he had for the past 20,000 years. The clown instructor suggested that protagonist was probably just showing off since he'd only recently reached the chi refinement stage. Instructor Mei, however, doubted he'd even make it past the first test. At this point, instructor Mei gathered everyone's everyone's attention, announcing that he would be overseeing their evaluation. He explained that only those who passed all rounds of the entrance test would be eligible to become disciples of Shen Tian Academy. As Mei spoke, Protagonist couldn't shake a sense of familiarity with him. Curious, Mei approached Protagonist, who seemed to be staring at him strangely. Protagonist clarified that it wasn't the instructor's face. He was just distracted by how shiny Mei's necklace was. Everyone quickly noticed that instructor Mei wasn't actually flying but hanging by some sort of wire. To add to the awkwardness, as he descended, he went back up again, unable to control the height. Bai Di, witnessing all this, wondered aloud why Shen Tian Academy's instructors couldn't even fly properly, and to make matters worse, a newcomer had noticed. The clown instructor snickered, wishing Protagonist luck, implying he'd messed with the wrong person. Meanwhile, Mei dramatically ripped his shirt open, claiming the display was to lighten the mood. Protagonist couldn't help but wonder if the shirt tearing was really necessary, but others were more focused on the instructor's muscles. One of the side characters, the shiny head, exclaimed that the instructor had the legendary sacred sandbag body. He explained that this sacred body couldn't actively cultivate or use spells, but could absorb opponents' attacks, capturing spiritual energy and channeling it for his own use. In other words, the more he got beaten up, the stronger he became. This essentially made him immune to attacks from others of the same level. But from Protagonist's perspective, he thought the instructor was actually a masochist. Protagonist began to wonder if masochists had taken over the cultivation world. Then the instructor announced that each person should punch him using their spiritual energy, so he could assess their strength, talent, and potential. Truthfully, though, he was just looking to humiliate Protagonist, ensuring that the first test would be under his control. This way, if Protagonist defended him again, he could simply fail him. Naturally, Protagonist was up first. Protagonist decided to give it his best shot since he knew he was pretty strong. But the instructor was unconcerned, confident that Protagonist couldn't possibly harm him. After all, not even the born soul creator could hurt him. But with just one punch, Protagonist sent the instructor flying through all the academy walls. No one could believe it, not even the clown instructor, who was left speechless. Protagonist, meanwhile, was shaking in fear. If he shook any harder, he'd cause another earthquake. But surprisingly, after all that, he'd managed to pass the evaluation. Everyone took a step back, and on the rooftop, Xiaoyu had seen everything, smirking that she'd expected Protagonist to draw attention on his first day. Some onlookers questioned the shiny head on why the instructor had been knocked so far, especially since he supposedly couldn't be hurt by someone below the rising soul stage. Shiny head admitted he wasn't sure, as there was no mention of this in the books. Bai Di, observing from a distance, concluded that she wasn't the only one hiding her true strength. The clown instructor even remarked that Protagonist's punch had the power of someone at the rising soul stage. Just then, the instructor, groggy from his flight, staggered back to Protagonist, accusing him of hitting him before he was ready. He complained that Protagonist was supposed to hit his belly, not his face. Protagonist apologized again, much to the delight of the onlookers, who were now doubting if the legendary sacred sandbag body could really withstand anything. The instructor declared that the test didn't count and warned Protagonist that if he cheated again, he'd be disqualified. At this point, Instructor Mei activated his maximum defensive move, which, according to Shiny Head, was called the immovable sandbag and represented the highest defensive power of the sacred sandbag body. He boasted that he only used this technique in final tests against cultivators at the tribulation transfer stage, so this time, Protagonist wouldn't be able to budge him. And indeed, he didn't fly off this time. His expression remained impassive, and everyone cheered for the instructor. But the clown instructor, suspicious, noticed something was wrong. Instructor Mei had fainted while standing up. To save face, the clown instructor declared that Instructor Mei wasn't feeling well, and thus, everyone passed the first test. The students were thrilled. They'd passed the first phase without even trying. Tai Xiankao approached Protagonist, expressing surprise at finding another strong person in the evaluation. He introduced himself as the 108th successor of the Hahuan sect, explaining that his hobbies included dual cultivation. Approaching Protagonist, he declared that he'd reluctantly accept Protagonist as his brother based on his strength. Internally, Protagonist suspected Tai was trying to set up a dual cultivation session with him, but he set those thoughts aside. Some of the side characters, including Shiny Head, asked if they too could be accepted as younger brothers. Shiny Head introduced himself as Tianji and offered to gather the most accurate information for his older brothers. Apologetically, he explained that he needed to gather information on Protagonist since Protagonist was still relatively unknown. Looking at Shiny Head, Protagonist was reminded of his own past self. The first question Shiny Head asked was which sect Protagonist was from. This stumped Protagonist since he couldn't exactly exactly say he was from the demonic sect. Fortunately, Bai Di appeared, slapping protagonist and declaring that she'd show him the gap between him and a true genius. She then walked off dramatically. For some reason, the story then cut to a mysterious masked figure. Meanwhile, the clown instructor caught everyone's attention, pressing a button on a control behind him. A massive platform began to rise, forming large walls that created a huge square dome around the area. Inside the arena, there were robots? Wait, isn't this supposed to be a cultivation world? What are robots doing in a martial arts setting? This Murim world is totally glitched. Protagonist spends 20,000 years training, only to come back to a place with robots? At this point, it hardly feels like Murim anymore. Everything's gone weird. Naturally, everyone was stunned by the robots. The clown instructor, aka Traffic Light, announced he'd be the examiner for the second round. His real name is Huang Luhong, but let's stick with Traffic Light. He explained that these puppet mechanisms had been designed by Chao Pavilion. During the test, the puppets would continuously launch hidden weapons to attack them. The goal was to endure until the incense burned out. If they could withstand the attacks without asking for help and without retaliating, they'd score higher. According to him, this phase was notoriously tough. It was even nicknamed the Candidate Cemetery because only the most skilled and lucky recruits passed. As expected, chaos erupted. Protagonist was dodging the attacks well, while the Traffic Light instructor noticed that Zhong Ma from the Hei Huan sect was handling the attacks with ease, skillfully using a specific stance. Then he looked over and saw Protagonist digging a hole. Protagonist figured he'd just dig himself into the ground and avoid getting hit altogether. Traffic Light instructor was furious. This was supposed to be a speed and endurance test, not a digging contest. Well guys, that's where I'll wrap it up for this video. If you like this new Mecha Murim story, leave a comment with Murim Mecha or Mecha Murim, because this Murim world is clearly glitched. I've never seen a martial arts world with robots except a nanomachine, but even then, the robots just inside the protagonist. Alright, see you in the next video. I'm rambling now.